Elena. Elena is a legal fellow at New York Civil Liberties Union and is working on the solitary confinement project. Will you be talking about Boxdale a little bit? Okay. It's an important report on the increasing use of solitary confinement in New York State prisons. Previously, she interned at the Prisoners' Rights Project of the Legal Aid Society. Also a member of UNRWA, Human Rights Impact Litigation. What a group we have here. Where she litigated on behalf of Tamil victims of torture and war crimes in Sri Lanka.
So David did a really great job in laying out the history of solitary confinement in the country, and I'm going to focus on findings of a report that the New York Civil Liberties Union just released 2 weeks ago about the costs of extreme isolation in New York. Our report was a product of a year-long investigation that involved communicating with over 100 prisoners who spent time in extreme isolation. We also interviewed family members, correctional staff. We analyzed regulations of the Department of Corrections and Community Supervision, and we also analyzed data that we obtained through New York's open records laws. What we found is that New York's use of extreme isolation is arbitrary, it's inhumane, and it's unsafe. Our investigation focused on a few main questions. Most importantly, who is in extreme isolation and how did they get there? And then what are the effects of extreme isolation? We found that too frequently, extreme isolation is used as a disciplinary tool of first resort. The investigation that we did, in our investigation, we found that 90% of prisoners who are currently in extreme isolation are there for disciplinary reasons. But the vast majority of them aren't there because they're the worst of the worst. There are hundreds of rules that prisoners must obey in prison, and the violation of any one of them can possibly result in punishment in extreme isolation. That's really the core reason that many prisoners wind up getting put into extreme isolation. More importantly, though, there are no meaningful constraints on how corrections staff deal with prisoner misbehavior. Corrections officers have wide discretion to impose extreme isolation as punishment and to impose it for very long periods of time. This virtually unlimited discretion leads to the result that prisoners in extreme isolation are people who belong to vulnerable populations. They could be juveniles, the elderly, people with mental illness, and people with substance abuse issues. Another result of this discretion that corrections officers have is that overwhelmingly, Black prisoners make up the majority of the people who are in extreme isolation. In fact, Black prisoners make up 59% of the people in extreme isolation. Prisoners are subjected to extreme isolation for minor, nonviolent misbehavior. We found that from 2007 to 2011, more than 68,000 disciplinary hearings resulted in punishment in extreme isolation. Only 16% of those disciplinary hearings related to violent misbehavior. Put differently, 5 out of 6 sentences to extreme isolation related to nonviolent misbehavior. And that could be anything from smoking to failing to return a food tray, or lying, or having unauthorized papers in your cell. Prisoners are subjected to extreme isolation for very long periods of time, and there are no upper limits on how long a prisoner can stay in isolation. We found that the average sentence of extreme isolation is 5 months, but many people actually spend much longer than that. So what might initially begin as a 6-month sentence to extreme isolation winds up being a year or 2 years long. Prisoners can also max out in extreme isolation. What that means is that they have so many disciplinary sentences that the entire time that they have to serve in extreme isolation winds up being longer than the remainder of their entire prison sentence. That means that they're in isolation until the day that they're released from prison. And when a prisoner is in isolation, they receive absolutely no programming, no classes, no training, nothing to help them prepare for transition to life outside prison. The second question that we focused on was what are the effects of extreme isolation? As scientific studies have previously concluded, extreme isolation causes grave emotional and psychological harm. Prisoners who shared their experiences with us described feeling apathy, anxiety, despair, uncontrollable impulses that led to uncontrollable outbursts. Even the healthy and mentally stable described these effects in their letters to us. The people who have mental illness suffered even more devastating effects. But prisoners aren't the only ones who experience detrimental effects from being in extreme isolation. Family members who know that loved ones are in extreme isolation also suffer. And also correctional staff who we spoke to in our investigation reported detrimental effects of working in these environments. They described feeling that stress permeated all aspects of their lives and even outside the workplace. The NYCLU study confirms that New York's use of extreme isolation is arbitrary and it's inhumane. It's legally indefensible, and it's a human rights crisis. New York should follow the example led by other states, such as Maine and Mississippi, who've dramatically changed the way that they use extreme isolation. They've analyzed how they use extreme isolation, and they've managed to dramatically reduce the number of prisoners in extreme isolation. They've done so without any adverse consequences to safety and security, and they've actually reported positive outcomes. They reported decreased violence in the prisons and economic savings, as well as better working conditions for their staff. The New York Civil Liberties Union has been discussing certain measures that can be pursued for reform. And the key recommendation that we include in the report is having stringent criteria that set clear and objective standards for who should be placed in extreme isolation, and what kinds of, in particular, what kinds of conduct would lead to some kind of punishment in extreme isolation. It shouldn't be a nonviolent offense. It shouldn't be minor misconduct. We're also recommending that New York should conduct an audit of the current population in extreme isolation to know who should be transferred out. We realized through our report that many of the people who are in extreme isolation right now should never have been put there in the first place. And having an audit of the current population will allow prisoners who are currently there to be reviewed under objective criteria. In my comments right now, I'm focused more on our findings that we included in the report, but if you haven't already done so, I'd encourage you to read the report and also to visit our website, which contains letters from prisoners and really gives voice to their experiences in extreme isolation. We also have a Take Action page, which will allow you to send an email to Commissioner Brian Fisher and Governor Cuomo, urging them to implement reform. And we're also going to be working on building a coalition of advocates, of people who are interested in this issue, of human rights groups and faith communities. So if you're interested in this issue, we would encourage you to reach out to us and to participate in the coalition. Thank you.